Jill didn't know any young child who could resist homemade chocolate chip cookies, still warm from the oven and washed down with a tall glass of cold milk. She'd whipped up a batch of dough 3 days ago, and it had been sitting in the refrigerator waiting for the little boy to appear at the edge of the woods. But her young friend didn't seem inclined to make his presence known when Keith was around. However, she'd heard the crunch of gravel on her driveway a couple of hours ago, meaning Keith had gone out. She'd been watching the woods ever since from the window of her spare bedroom turned studio. So far, though, she'd seen no sign of her young caller. If he didn't come soon, she'd have to bake the cookies and either eat them or send them over to Keith. At the thought of her paying guest, Jill combed her fingers through her hair and tried to still the nervous flutter in her stomach. Although he seemed nice enough, she felt edgy and tense in his presence. A feeling prompted, she suspected, by the deliberate way he'd looked at her scar that first day, then commented about it instead of ignoring it. She wasn't used to that kind of blatant, almost matter-of-fact perusal, and she wasn't sure she wanted to get used to it, for reasons she wasn't inclined to consider. As she daubed a bright color on the canvas in front of her, she wondered what the island people thought of her reclusive life. She supposed most would attribute it to vanity, but she knew better. Any vanity she might once have had been expunged long ago. No, she'd withdrawn from the world for other reasons. Weariness, for one. She'd grown tired of dealing with the questioning looks, the averted glances, the expressions of pity. Tired and sad. It grieved her that no one could see past her scars to the woman she had once been, or was even willing to try. Then Keith Michaels had walked into her life, and for the first time a stranger had looked at her as a person. Yes, he'd been shocked initially. As Deb would say, that was just human nature. The scars were horrendous. But once he'd recovered, he'd looked at her in a way no one except her family had since the accident. Like he could accept her disfigurement, could see past it to the tender heart that still beat within her. In his eyes she'd detected compassion and kindness and acceptance. It had been the kind of look that could engender friendship. But if she opened the door to friendship, she'd have to talk about what happened. And she wasn't ready to do that yet. Maybe she never would be. The hurt went too deep. The loss was too grievous. Burying those emotions had been her best coping mechanism, and she was afraid to upset the delicate balance she'd created in her life. Talking about them would be as painful as ripping the crust off a newly formed scab. That's why she'd kept herself scarce over the past few days. She didn't want to run into her tenant again. Besides, she had plenty of work to do in the studio, even if she was starting to go stir crazy. Her pattern had been to spend a part of every day outside, walking to the shore, working in her garden, painting in the early morning and late afternoon light. Being cooped up didn't suit her for extended periods. She'd spent way too much time in sterile environments, confined to antiseptic smelling hospitals, sequestered in darkened rooms. She needed fresh air and sunlight like she needed water and food. As a result, she wasn't sorry to hear Keith drive off that morning, nor was she surprised when she spotted the young boy at the edge of the field half an hour later. Moving into high gear, she cleaned her brushes. Then she headed for the kitchen to scoop out dough for the first tray of cookies, her foot tapping out an impatient rhythm as they baked. How could 10 minutes seem like forever? Please, Lord, let the boy stay long around enough for me to make contact, she prayed. When at last the cookies were done, she put 8 on a plate and poured a tall glass of milk. Tucking a copy of Tom Sawyer, retrieved from a long-packed box of books, under her arm, she pulled on her hat and headed out, forcing herself to walk at a slow pace that wouldn't frighten him away. As she approached, he ducked behind a boulder, peeking out as she deposited the plate and milk on a rock. He remained motionless as she moved off a bit to sit in the shade of an old apple tree gone wild, her back against the trunk as she munched on a cookie. I brought some cookies and milk for you, too, in case you're hungry, she called out. And I thought you might like to know how our little bird is faring. He's eating, and he's starting to get a few feathers. I named him Homer. She kept up a steady stream of banter, and as she talked, the young boy eased closer, casting furtive looks into the woods over his shoulder. When he reached the treat she'd set out, he gobbled up the cookies, downed the milk in one long gulp, then retreated to his place behind the boulders. Reaching for the book, Jill opened it to the first page. I found one of my favorite books the other day. It's a story about a young boy who has some great adventures. I thought I'd read it again. Pitching her voice to a volume he could hear, she began to speak the words she recalled from her childhood. For a long time, only the sound of her voice broke the stillness in the meadow. She noticed that her young friend settled into a more comfortable position beside the rocks instead of crouching, poised to flee, as was his typical stance. A good sign, she concluded. He seemed to be more relaxed around her today. Or at least he was until the scrunch of tires on the gravel announced her tenant's return. One thing Jill didn't have to worry about was her young visitor's hearing. The second the sound registered, he was on his feet. When a quick glance confirmed that a car was coming up the drive, he took off at a run, disappearing into the woods in a flash. Sighing, Jill rose and gathered up the remnants of his snack. Not a crumb remained on the plate, causing her to wonder yet again if he got enough to eat at home, wherever that might be. She'd also noticed that he had been wearing the same clothes today as on other occasions, suggesting a life of either extreme poverty or neglect. Like the baby bird she was tending, her young visitor looked like he could use some TLC. As she started back toward the house, she was surprised to see Keith's car slowing by her front porch. She supposed he might be stopping by to tell her that he was moving on. A sudden pang in the pit of her stomach caught her unaware, and she frowned. She'd known that he was only planning to stay a few days, and she'd seen very little of him during his visit. In fact, she'd gone to great lengths to avoid him. In light of that, why should the thought of his departure produce such an empty feeling inside? Before she could analyze her reaction, Keith got out of the car and headed her way, balancing a large pizza box in his hands. When he drew close, the savory aroma wafted her way, setting off a rumble in her stomach that reminded her she hadn't yet had lunch. A furrow creased his brow when he saw the empty plate and glass in her hand, and his step faltered. "Did you eat lunch already? I was hoping you'd join me. I picked this up in town, and it's way too much for one person. Besides, I owe you a meal after that great soup you left for me." Surprised by the unexpected invitation, Jill eyed the box as she searched for her voice. She hadn't had pizza in ages. Once, in a long ago life, it had been a menu staple for her family on Friday night as they celebrated the end of the work week by indulging in their favorite takeout food. Since the accident, however, pizza had held little appeal. But all at once she was ravenous. Still, Keith didn't owe her a thing, and spending time in his company didn't seem like a good idea. Shaking her head, she made a move to continue toward the house. "Thanks, but there's no obligation." Instead of stepping aside to let her pass, as she expected, Keith remained in place. Tipping back her head, she sent him a puzzled look from under the rim of her wide-brimmed hat. "I can't eat all this by myself." He grinned at her and waved the box under her nose. "There's plenty for two." Unlike pancakes, pizza is good left over. You can finish it tomorrow. "Ah, tomorrow. That's a topic I want to discuss with you. We could talk over lunch." The man wasn't giving up, Jill realized. And the pizza did smell good. What harm could it do to share a meal with him? He'd be gone soon, anyway. In fact, that could be what he wanted to talk about. No sense putting off the inevitable. Okay, we can eat on the back porch. I'll heat up the pizza and get some drinks. Great. I'll run down to the cottage and put a few perishables away. After handing over the box, he turned and strode back towards his car. For a few seconds, Jill stared after him. Then she continued toward the house, still not sure this impromptu lunch was wise, and still not sure how Keith had convinced her to accept. But he did have an engaging grin, and she did find him intriguing. Who was he, really? He didn't strike her as the drifter type by nature, yet it sounded as if that was what he'd been doing for quite a while. Why? What was the source of the restlessness she sensed in his soul? Those questions had kept her awake late into the night way too often since his arrival. Of course, her curiosity might be nothing more than the reflection of her isolated existence. A long stifled hunger for simple human interaction. Yet that didn't ring quite true. There was something about this man that gave her a sense of connectedness, was the word that came to mind. As if they were linked by some common thread she couldn't quite identify. Now there was a far-fetched, fanciful notion. If she'd ever heard one, she chided herself. What could she possibly have in common with this stranger? A refugee from a storm who had appeared on her doorstep by pure chance. Pushing through the screen door, Jill took the pizza out of the box, set the oven temperature, and slid it inside. Pure chance. She mulled over her choice of words, thinking about the verse from Jeremiah. For I know well the plans I have in mind for you, plans for your welfare, not for woe, plans to give you a future full of hope. Could Keith's unexpected visit be part of God's plan for her, rather than chance? If he hadn't arrived on the 4th of July weekend, if he hadn't stopped at the market, if the checker hadn't thought of her cottage, he would have never come her way. It was hard to believe that coincidence could account for all those pieces falling into place. But perhaps she was overanalyzing. Once they shared their lunch, he'd probably settle his bill, pack up his car, and leave, closing out this odd chapter in her life. She'd know soon enough, she supposed. In the meantime, she might as well bake the rest of the cookies for dessert. She had a feeling her temporary tenant would enjoy them just as much as the mysterious little boy. As Keith splashed some water on his face and toweled it dry, the terry cloth scratching against the rough stubble on his chin, he tried to figure out what had prompted him to invite his landlady to share his lunch. He hadn't intended to. The idea hadn't even occurred to him until he'd driven up the driveway and seen her walking across the field, her face shaded by her ever-present hat. She seemed so alone, and once more he'd been struck by her isolation. It didn't feel right for such a young woman to be cut off from the world, even if the isolation was self-imposed. Didn't she yearn for human interaction? If once she had loved, didn't she miss that physical connectedness as he did? The entwined hands, the comforting hugs, the soft smiles and warm gazes that said, "You matter to me." But all those things had been stolen from him, as had the calling that had once been the center of his life. Stolen through spite and retribution, leaving him with a legacy of such deep hatred and disillusionment that he'd been barely able to function for months. He'd hoped, in time, that those destructive feelings would dissipate. He wanted his life back, wanted to rid himself of the debilitating emotions that held him hostage. That was why he'd set off on his cross-country quest. He hadn't made much progress yet, but at least he was still trying. And that was the difference between him and his landlady, he suspected. She'd stopped trying to get past whatever it is that held her captive in her self-imposed isolation. What he had first attributed to acceptance, he now recognized more as resignation. And there was a world of difference between the two. Perhaps that's why he just issued his impromptu lunch invitation. She'd given him new reason to hope. Maybe, on some subconscious level, he'd felt obliged to try and return the favor. Whatever the motive, he found himself looking forward to sharing a meal with her. He'd already seen evidence of her kind, compassionate, caring nature. What other surprise did this reclusive hostess have to offer, hidden behind the wall she had built around herself? Breaching that wall wouldn't be easy, of course. She didn't seem to let anyone through, but difficult as it would be to break through her defenses, he knew that the real challenge today would be getting her to go along with the plan he'd formulated on his way back from town. Jill peered out the window as Keith approached across the field, wiped her damp palms on her jeans, and reached for her oven mitts. It was ridiculous to be nervous about sharing a meal with someone, so she was a little bit out of practice. Well, maybe more than a little, considering she hadn't broken bread with another living soul since Deb and Dominic had visited the year before. But she'd shared plenty of meals with people in her whole life. She and Sam had given some great dinner parties, filled with laughter and spirited conversation, that ebbed and flowed with a natural, easy grace. She knew how to make small talk. It would come back to her, like riding a bicycle. She was sure of it. Sort of. As she carried the pizza out to the table, already set with plates, forks, and water glasses, Keith came up the stairs. She sat and motioned him to the chair across from her. I always say grace before meals. I hope you don't mind. Without waiting for him to respond, she bowed her head, the floppy brim of her hat obscuring her features. Though it felt awkward, Keith was left with no option but to follow her example as she began to speak. Lord, we thank you for this meal and for the many blessings you bestow on us. Keep us always in your care, deepen our faith, and grant us the light of your hope even on our darkest days. Amen. Keith's throat tightened at the simple, heartfelt prayer. How had Jill known to ask for the very things he most needed? Or did she need them too? Raising his head, he looked across at her, his eyes searching, probing. She met his gaze for the briefest second, then lowered her chin and reached for a piece of pizza. Once more, the wide brim hid her face from his view. Do you always wear that hat? He asked, his tone conversational. For an instant, her hand stilled as she weighed her response to the unexpected question. I need to protect my skin from the sun. Her cautious, just drop it inflection wasn't lost on Keith. But something impelled him to press on. It's not sunny up here. A knot formed in Jill's stomach. So much for small talk. While she'd been trying to think of insane, surface things to discuss, like the weather and sightseeing, he was diving right into deep water. The pizza's getting cold, she responded. Silence greeted her comment. She could feel his scrutiny as she rearranged the pepperoni on top of her slice. She could sense that he wanted to say more, and she held her breath. Only when he helped himself to a piece of pizza did she exhale, assuming he was going to drop the subject. She was wrong. The breath caught in her throat at his next remark. I've already seen your face, Jill. Startled, she stared at him, unsure how to respond. Most people dance around the subject of her appearance. He seemed to prefer addressing it head on, in an easy, straightforward manner, and it rattled her. Color stole up her neck and she looked down, playing with her checkered napkin. I always wear the hat around people. Why? This was getting way too personal. Why do you want to know? She turned his question around on him, her tone wary, stalling as she tried to think of some response that would deflect his inquiry. You have lovely hair, and your eyes are the color of autumn. It's a shame to keep all that beauty hidden away. Whatever Jill had been expecting him to say, that wasn't it. She could only stare at him, speechless. If Jill was surprised by his comment, Keith was even more stunned. Where in the world had that come from? He wasn't a smooth talker, not when it came to women. Never had been. And in the past 2 years, he'd gone out of his way to walk a wide circle around females in general, to give no indication that he'd noticed them, let alone found them attractive. Yet he'd paid the woman across from him a direct compliment, going against all the rules he'd written for himself. But Jill seemed so in need of tender care, just like the baby bird she continued to nurture. The words had come out before he'd had a chance to consider their ramification. As he watched, soft color spilled onto her left cheek, confirming his suspicion that she was unaccustomed to flattery about her physical appearance. He waited, not sure if she would ignore him or reply. A few seconds ticked by, and all at once he saw the sudden sheen of tears in her eyes. His gut tightened, and his immediate instinct was to reach over and wrap her long, tapering fingers in a comforting grip. Instead, he dropped his hands to his lap and balled his fists around his napkin before he did anything inappropriate. Just as he prepared to change the subject, she surprised him by answering his questions about the hat. My scars make people uncomfortable. It's easier if they don't have to look at my face. So I do what I can to camouflage them, she told him in a subdued voice. His simple, sincere compliment had shattered her defenses and compelled her to respond. They don't make me uncomfortable. Curious, she studied his features, finding only honesty in his eyes. Why not? Why should they? What counts is a person inside, and I've seen enough since I've been here to know you're kind, caring, and compassionate. Your willingness to take me in during the storm is proof enough of that, let alone everything else you've done to make me feel welcome. And I've seen your concern about that young boy, not to mention the way you rescued the baby bird. All those things tell me you have a good heart, a beautiful heart. His words warmed her, but they didn't change the reality. In a not so pretty package. Is that why you hide out here, away from everybody? I'm not hiding. Her response was swift, too swift, and to her surprise, defensive. Confused and suddenly uncertain, she frowned. Why should she be defensive? After all, Keith was dead wrong. She wasn't hiding. People only hid when they're afraid of something, when they felt threatened by imminent danger and were seeking safety. Her reasons for withdrawing from the world had nothing to do with fear or safety. Absolutely none. She took a deep breath and tried again. Look, this is just easier for a lot of reasons. His eyes narrowed in speculation. Like vanity? No! Her denial was instant and vehement. This, at least, she was sure about. Then take it off. Take off the hat. Startled by the challenge, she stared at him. Her hat was her security blanket, her protection from the eyes of the world, in a figurative sense, if nothing else. Without it, she'd feel exposed and vulnerable. Only around family and her doctors did she take it off. Yet, she now found herself giving serious consideration to picking up the gauntlet Keith had tossed down. But why? As she grappled to find that elusive answer, she searched his face. He continued to regard her across the table, his gaze steady, supportive, and sure. Matter of fact even, as if her disfigurement, when fully exposed, wouldn't have any effect on the way he looked at her or treated her. And in fact, she already had evidence to support that. He'd seen her without her hat once, for a brief instant. And later, when her hat was back in place, he looked right at her shadowed scars and commented about them. In their subsequent conversation, she'd seen no indication that they made him uncomfortable. Nothing to suggest that he was morbidly curious about them. It was as if he'd accepted that her scars were just a part of her, the same way her hair and her eyes were, a physical feature that had nothing to do with who she was as a person. Removing her hat wouldn't shock him. She suspected he wouldn't even blink. That was why she felt safe enough to consider his challenge. Besides, she didn't want him to think she wore the hat out of vanity. For some reason, it was important to her to set the record straight on that. With trembling fingers, she reached up and slowly pulled the hat off, letting her hair tumble around her shoulders in soft waves. As she did so, she found strength in a familiar Bible verse that had often replayed in her mind like a mantra during difficult encounters. She spoke it now in a quiet, not quite steady voice. Not as a man sees does God see, because man sees the appearance, but the Lord looks into the heart. Samuel. A flicker of surprise scuttled across her face. She wouldn't have expected her guest to be well versed in scripture. Most people have a hard time seeing past the scars. That's their loss. He rested his elbows on the table and linked his fingers. She managed to endure his scrutiny without flinching, but it was one of the hardest things she'd ever done. Her whole body was quivering, like it had been the day she left home for college. Although eager to step into the world at large, she'd also been anxious about the unknown that lay ahead, and certain that things would never quite be the same again. She felt like that now. As Keith looked at the woman across from him, he did his best to maintain a passive expression, but it was difficult. Now he better understood what she meant about the way people looked at her. His brief glimpse of her scars that first morning when he'd repaired the siding hadn't prepared him for the extent of her injury, fully exposed now in the midday light. And it was a hard thing to get past. A good portion of the right side of her face was discolored, a mottled red intermixed with shiny, taunt skin that wasn't quite normal in texture or color, parts of the surface uneven and rigid. Nothing less than a severe burn could produce a scar like that. The edge of the scar touched the outside of Jill's eye, and he focused there, trying to regulate his breathing as he grappled with the severity of her injury. "Is your eye okay?" It was all he could do to maintain a conversational tone. "Yes, I was lucky. I could have lost my sight." "It's a burn, right?" "Yeah." "How long ago?" "3.5 years." He took another few seconds to examine her face, his perusal unhurried. She expected his next question to be, "What happened?" and she tried to prepare for it, to figure out how she could deflect it. She wasn't ready for that discussion. Taking off the hat had been traumatic enough for one day. But he surprised her. Instead of probing further, he just repeated a comment he'd made that first day. "I'm sorry, Jill. I can't even begin to imagine the horror of a burn like that. But it doesn't change my impression of you. Now let's eat our pizza before it gets cold." Although he took a hearty bite of his slice, Jill didn't think she'd be able to swallow anything. Her emotions were too chaotic. But somehow Keith managed to calm her down. He told her about his trip to East Sound, asked about the climate on the island, spoke of her mysterious young visitor, inquired about the baby bird. In other words, he made a small talk. Odd. That was how Jill had expected to start the meal. Instead, he'd reversed things. But it worked. By getting the awkwardness out of the way at the beginning, he made it possible for her to relax for the rest of the meal, instead of worrying about if or when he'd broach the subject of her appearance. On top of that, he paid no special attention to her scar. When he spoke to her, he looked into her eyes, not at her disfigured face. By the end of the meal, she was more at ease than she would ever have imagined possible. For a brief few minutes, she even forgot about the scar. When they were done, she collected their plates, then went to retrieve the plate of still warm chocolate chip cookies. Keith's face lit up when she carried them through the door, and she couldn't help smiling. I think these had the same effect on my young visitor this morning. It must be a male thing. She deposited the plate on the table, along with a mug of coffee, strong and black, the way he'd taken it that first morning at breakfast. An appreciative smile curved his lips as he picked it up, and he gave her a mock toast. Just the way I like it. Thanks for remembering. His compliment brought a warm glow to her heart, and she took her place across from him, reaching for a cookie. When you got back earlier, you said you wanted to talk about your plans. They had had a nice meal, and she'd enjoyed the brief interlude very much. But if he was going to leave tomorrow, there was no sense putting off that discussion. Even if raising the subject did cause that odd, empty feeling to reappear in the pit of her stomach. Instead of eating her cookie, she broke it into pieces as she waited for him to respond. To buy himself a little time, Keith took a long, slow sip of his coffee. All the plans he'd formulated on the drive back from town rested on one big contingency: whether or not he could stay on at Rainbow's End. The peace and serenity he'd found here was a real attraction of this island. Without that, there was no reason to linger. So the first trick was convincing her to let him remain. If he succeeded at that, his next challenge would be to find a way to fund an extended visit. And he hoped she could help him with that too. Withdrawing an envelope from his pocket, he laid it out on the table next to her plate. This should settle up my bill through tonight. The knot in Jill's stomach tightened, and she clenched her hands in her lap, fixing her attention on the plate in front of her. I've enjoyed my visit here. In fact, I'd like to stay on for a while, if you'll let me, he continued. Her chin jerked up, and Keith didn't quite know how to interpret the look in her eyes. He'd almost call it relief, but that didn't make any sense. You want to stay? Jill was having a hard time digesting that, since she'd already reconciled herself to his imminent departure. Yes, I do. An almost euphoric feeling welled up inside her. Okay. Now it was his turn to stare. Okay. A warning light flashed in her heart, telling her to proceed with caution, but she ignored it. Yeah, okay. He'd never expected it to be this easy. That's great. Thank you. But the thing is, I do have a little cash flow problem. I've been on the road for almost a year and my funds are running pretty low. Despite the great rates you charge, I can't stay a whole lot longer unless I find work. I was hoping you'd be able to point me to some area contractors or carpenters who might be interested in taking on a temporary employee. You don't need to worry about the money. I told you, the cabin is just sitting there vacant. You're welcome to use it as long as you like. I won't stay without paying my way. I don't need the money, Keith. I told you that when you first brought this up. Maybe not, but I need to pay. Ah, it was a pride thing, Jill realized, backing off. Okay, fine. The rate's less for an extended stay. It can't get much less. Yes, it can. When the weekly rate she quoted brought a frown to his face, she crossed her hands over her chest. And I won't consider a penny more. Take it or leave it. At first she thought he was going to argue, but once again he surprised her by chuckling instead. You drive a hard bargain, lady. A smile twitched at the corners of her mouth. Does that mean we have a deal? Yeah. He held out his hands, and after a brief hesitation she took it. His fingers closed around hers, warm and strong and firm, and she was sorry when he let go. But I still need to find work. Can you direct me to anyone? I'm afraid not. I don't know many of the island people. Suddenly an inspiration began to take shape in her mind, and her expression grew thoughtful. But I have an idea. I've been waiting to build a studio ever since I got here. The upstairs room I use now isn't ideal. I've even drawn up a design. Leaning back in his chair, he wrapped his hands around his mug. So you're the artist. I saw all the equipment in the cabin the night I arrived. The irony wasn't lost on him. What a cruel twist of fate that a woman who created beauty should have her own so disfigured. I try, anyway. I use the cabin as a studio at first, but there's not enough light there. The ideal spot would be over there. She indicated an empty stretch of ground behind the left side of the house. How about this? I'll supply the materials and the design. You build me the studio, and we'll call it even, a barter arrangement. The idea appealed to Keith. If he built a studio for Jill, he could spend most of his time at Rainbow's End. What could be more perfect? But as he prepared to accept, he saw indecision cloud her eyes. What's wrong? Her guest was observant. She'd give him that. It just occurred to me that you'll be getting the short end of this deal. You'd come out ahead financially by working for someone else and paying me rent. Besides, a project this size would take weeks. And you haven't said how long you plan to stay. She played with her cookie, which had now been reduced to crumbs. The tension on his face eased. Forget about the money. I'm not here to get rich. And as for the construction schedule, it could take anywhere from 3 or 4 weeks to 3 or 4 months to complete, depending on how grandiose your plans are. But I'm in no hurry to leave. And the arrangement sounds fine to me. If you throw in a hot meal every day, that is. And that's my counteroffer. Take it or leave it. He grinned at her, and an ember of happiness ignited deep in Jill's heart. It was tiny, but it was there. She told herself it was because at long last she would get the studio she'd always wanted. But it was more than that, and she knew it. Her happiness had been fueled by the man who sat across from her, Keith Michaels, with his direct manner and his ability to coax her out of the solitary world she created for herself, had brought a refreshing newness to a life that had begun to grow stale. Until he'd knocked at her door, she hadn't even realized that at some point over the past couple of years, her life had gone from comfortable to confining. Once more, the verse from Jeremiah replayed in her mind, and as it did, she sensed that Keith Michaels was part of whatever plan God had in mind for her. Now, she just needed to put her trust in the Lord and see where He led her. Okay, that completes tonight's reading. Sleep well, sleep restful, and peacefully. Good night.